Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Fileable review session. We're going live at 8 o'clock, and we're talking about Period 5 in APUSH. My name is Mr. Lagerway, and I'm a teacher in Western Michigan, and just joining you here together this evening to talk a little bit about Period 5. And just a couple things before we get started, making sure that, one, everybody can hear me. So if you're able to hear me, go ahead and drop something in the chat. Maybe, let's say, what's your favorite part of Period 5? Maybe you've covered all of Period 5. Maybe you haven't yet. We're here to review the whole thing. So the more questions you have, the better. But if you are able to use the chat function on the lower right-hand side of your screen, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, there's also the Ask a Question function at the bottom. You can ask me questions there or in the chat. Either way, I'm here to answer your questions and make sure this is useful for you. So if you have a favorite part of Period 5, go ahead and put that in the chat. Also lets me know that I'm hearable and that you're able to communicate back and forth. Otherwise, I can get ourselves started and we'll move along with a couple more slides. So just a couple of reminders. If you're looking for good AP exam reviews, you can follow Fiveable on various social media places, right? So that you don't miss any of these live streams. We also have a couple more coming up. We have one more that covers Period 5, the last part, Reconstruction, sort of a deep dive into Reconstruction, coming up pretty soon, tomorrow. And then we start to go into semester review mode. And so we're going to see some of those with multiple choices and the free response questions. I myself am doing one about historical thinking skills in a little bit, in a few weeks. So just be aware that there's a lot of those coming, especially if you're here for APUSH and you're going to be having an APUSH exam coming up in December or maybe in January, or you just have a midterm and you want some sort of review. We're here for you, and we got plenty of videos and other resources to help you out. So what are we doing this evening? Well, this evening we're talking about Period 5. And I want to do Period 4, moving into Period 5, a little bit of contextualization, a little bit of what's the road to it, and also talk about some interesting overlap with dates. We'll get there in a little bit. Period 5 dates and the overview of what the dates mean and some of the very significant dates, especially early on, and then getting into the Period 5 practice problems after we do the overview, mostly consisting of short answer questions. You can extrapolate them. You can make them a whole lot longer if you want to make them into long essay questions. But for right now, just giving you some short answers that we can talk about and go through. So questions, Period 4 into 5. If you have any questions, again, feel free to put those into the chat. But one of the questions that I always want to consider with Period 4 into 5 is they kind of overlap a little bit, right? Period 5 technically starts in 1844. Period 4 ends in 1848. There's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But there's a lot of things going on in Period 4 that continue to be part of Period 5. And obviously, when it comes to a semester exam, they're going to be a bit mixed together anyway. I personally, with my APUSH class, I take all of the stuff that has to do with manifest destiny and westward expansion and slavery, and I throw that into Period 5 and just make Period 5 have this African Americans seeking their rights kind of theme to it. But that's not necessarily how everyone does it, so that's up to you. But Period 4 into Period 5, a couple of things that I think are especially relevant and might help to contextualize Period 5 as we go. So first thing is the Antebellum reform movements. Remember, during Period 4, we had the Second Great Awakening happen. We had this idea of personal perfectionism moving into an idea of social perfectionism. And so not only can we make ourselves better through religion in America, but also Americans begin to think that they can make society better, and they're religiously motivated. Now, there's a whole bunch of antebellum reform movements that you're probably aware of, but some of the most important are going to be, at least for Period 5, is going to be the Abolitionist Movement, right? So you're talking some William Lloyd Garrison, et cetera. We're also going to be looking at westward expansion and manifest destiny during Period 4. Manifest destiny is the idea coined around 1845 by John L. O'Sullivan, talking about should the United States annex and take over Texas, and why should we be able to spread across the entirety of the North American continent from sea to shining sea, or my favorite joke, to be more Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And that's the way that the United States can bring democracy, bring civilization, bring Christianity to all the quote-unquote savage peoples out there. So manifest destiny is moving west, but it also comes with this, again, the idea of slavery and should it expand or not. We will get into that in our next couple of slides here, but keep in mind that westward expansion and manifest destiny are incredibly closely linked in the APUSH curriculum to controversies over slavery and its expansion or lack thereof. We also have the market revolution. Remember the market revolution, or sometimes called the transportation and communication revolution. This is going to involve things like steamboats, telegraphs, and Erie Canal kind of stuff. and the American system with Henry Clay, etc. And this unites the North and the West and kind of cuts off the South. It leads to more sectional tensions, of course, and it also is going to lead to new ways of shipping cotton around and interesting connections there. The Industrial Revolution but this is the early parts of this, but that's going to continue on into period 5 and 6. And then we also have political parties in period 4, that the Whigs and the Democrats. Those are going to play an important role at the beginning of period 5 because they're going to split, and we're eventually going to get the third party system, the Republicans and the Democrats, although they have nothing to do with today's political parties. Sectional tensions are a big deal, right? So the South and the North are beginning to disagree on a lot of issues. They all tie back to slavery, of course, but a lot of these issues over tariffs, over taxes, over should we have slavery or not, and especially when it comes to expanding westward, how much should we invest in internal improvements, how much should we have representation in Congress, that all that kind of stuff. All of that is getting worse and worse during this time period, and that leads us eventually to the secession movement of the 1860s. And then finally, we have antebellum immigration. Antebellum immigration is kind of part of period 4, kind of part of period 5. It's a little bit of both, but this is talking about the 1840s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, where we have the new immigrants coming, and those are going to be the Irish and the Germans. This is going to lead to a little bit of backlash. We have the Know Nothing Party, the so-called nativist backlash. So nativism plays a role here. These German and Irish immigrants are going to play a large role in the Civil War. A lot of these Irish people will come over and then they will fight for the Union because they're landing in places like New York. And they're also going to form the backbone of the Democratic Party and the anti-draft riots that happened during the Civil War. So antebellum immigration is a big deal, but again, largely occurring up north, not necessarily down south. The South is the much more traditional society during this time, and that's going to play a role. And of course, you got to keep in mind, slavery is a huge deal during period 4. We have the transition from slavery is kind of an embarrassment, Thomas Jefferson idea into the John C. Calhoun, slavery is a positive good. We have the transition in the North of, slavery will eventually just go away to, it can't expand west to, no, we need to get rid of it altogether. Now, of course, both the North and the South are not monolithic. They are not gigantic collections of abolitionists up north and rabid slave owners down south. That's too simplistic, and please don't write like that. But do keep in mind that slavery is at the heart of all of these questions, and we do start to see some fighting going on where there are more abolitionists up north, there are more slaveholders down south. In that sense, there's some truth to the generalization that we're talking about. So that's kind of your transition in period 4 to 5. I would say one thing, and that is the market revolution is not explicitly connected to slavery in the way that, say, antebellum reform movements would be with, say, abolitionism. So if you're looking for good contextualization for an essay that's on African Americans during period 5, talking about the market revolution might not be a bad way to go about it, because the market revolution is going to lead to increased ability to transmit ideas, which include abolitionism, various newspapers, the North Star, the Liberator, etc., and the Southern Gag Rule, where they start to censor the post offices and things like that for abolitionist literature. It's a nice way to tie it in, but it's not explicitly connected to the prompt. Just an idea. So, period 5. Let's go over this a second. Oh, Ava had a good question here. Could you tie in the Free Soil Party with the market revolution? Absolutely. I think you could, yeah. The Free Soil Party is the one that wants to have westward expansion be only for white people, right? They want to have freedom out west, and it's not necessarily because there are a whole bunch of bleeding hearts who feel really bad about slavery, but mostly because they don't want competition from slavery, and they want to be able to have free white people move out west. And yeah, the Free Soil Party can't really talk about moving out west unless you have the market revolution, because otherwise you can't get your stuff from out west to the markets in the east, let alone to Europe, without things like canals and especially railroads. Yeah, great way to tie it in. I love it. I love it. So period 5, just to talk about some dates and some overviews real quick. Remember, it does go from 1844 to 1877. 1844, which again overlaps with period 4, thus the kind of confusing chronology there. 1844 is the election of James K. Polk. He was the Democratic president who was very much in favor of manifest destiny. He's the one that helps to annex and go to war with parts of Mexico. And then that's the whole Mexican-American War, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And then 1877, that's going to be the end of Reconstruction, the so-called Compromise of 1877. So your big 3 here after the overlap is going to be the road to the American Civil War, the Civil War itself, and the aftermath of the Civil War. Pardon me, just a second. We're going to talk about those three. So the road to the American Civil War, the Civil War itself, and the aftermath. Sometimes they have terms related to them, right? The aftermath of the American Civil War is called Reconstruction. That might be important. And the Civil War stands at the middle. Now, if you joined us earlier for some of the Civil War sessions or for the contextualization in period 5, you'll know that the Civil War, as much as some of us military historical nerds get really excited about the Civil War, it's not all about battle tactics. We're not going to be talking about Robert E. Lee versus Ulysses S. Grant at the Battle of, and fill in the blank with whatever battle you want to talk about. We're unfortunately going to be talking about bigger issues, which I think is fair given the fact that this is an overview course and not just focused on the Civil War. So we'll get there. But if you keep in mind the dates of period 5 and you keep in mind these three, it really helps you to start out broad, and then you can gradually move down to the more specific stuff if you need to for some of these questions. So let's dive right in. The road to the American Civil War. It's going to start in 1787, in a sense, with the whole ratification of the Constitution, which includes the 3/5 clause. Basically, the road to the American Civil War is going to be all of these compromises that America has made as they try to kick the can down the road and procrastinate when it comes to the issue of slavery. And so the Constitution, actually Abraham Lincoln says, if there was one point at which the Civil War became inevitable, it was the establishment of the Constitution with the 3/5 clause, because it kind of lay sleeping as a coiled serpent around the desks as they deliberated about the Constitution. So they compromised, but it ended up kicking the can down the road in a sense. 1793 is going to be an important date, and that's because that's the invention of the cotton gin. Eli Whitney's cotton gin transforms slavery. It makes it pay, as Ken Burns says, because before this, remember, a lot of the founding fathers thought slavery was going to be going away. Gradually, emancipation was happening in the North. Maybe this would happen for other people, and slavery just might not be economical over time. But it turns out that the cotton gin makes slavery incredibly profitable, makes the price of slaves go way, way up, and then it starts to deplete the soil as they grow more and more cotton, and thus it leads to the migration of the internal slave trade down to the Black Belt. You're talking Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama kind of areas. So that's a big deal too. 1808 is going to be an important year because 1808 is the end of the slave trade internationally anyway. So the slaves are no longer able to be imported. That was a compromise that was part of the Constitution. 1820 is our first big westward expansion compromise, and that's going to be the Compromise of 1820, otherwise known as the Missouri Compromise. And that's the one where Missouri becomes a free slave state, and then Maine becomes a free state. And there's that line, and we'll see a map of that in just a little bit, where slavery is below but not above, which makes sense for geographical reasons, right? You're able to grow cash crops like cotton that people want to have slaves to use. You're able to do that further down south and not so much in the northern Great Plains. 1831 is an interesting year because it hosts two different events, some of which are some people think that they're connected, but they're not really. This is going to be the publication of The Liberator as well as Nat Turner's Rebellion. The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's very strong abolitionist newspaper, where he gives that famous speech where he says, I will not compromise, I will not equivocate, I will be heard. He's very, very strong, strident in his abolitionist sentiment. And this comes out just a few months before Nat Turner leads the bloodiest slave rebellion in U.S. history. And some Southerners saw a connection between the two. Now, there's really no evidence that Nat Turner ever read The Liberator or that he was inspired by abolitionists up north or anything like that. But thus, that's just kind of in the minds of some people, that's a problem. We have 1846. That's the Mexican-American War. When that begins, the reason it's in bold, by the way, is because this is explicitly something that you must know according to the College Board's outline. So the Mexican-American War has a lot of effects, not the least of which are because it's going to lead to more questions of what do we do with the land that we take over. It's going to lead to some protests. Think of your Henry David Thoreau being in jail and not wanting to pay his taxes because he doesn't want to pay for slavery's expansion. This leads to the spot resolutions that Abraham Lincoln gives, where he talks about how he's not sure American blood has been spilled on American soil. This is kind of a microcosm, a small example of larger issues, especially when we get to 1848, when we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the United States suddenly takes over huge swaths of territory. It was proposed earlier that there was this thing called the Wilmot Proviso, where all land taken from Mexico would be free, but that was greatly opposed by a lot of these Southerners. And so the Wilmot Proviso, even though it's not passed, leads to huge controversy and a lot of acrimony and fighting in Congress. And then once the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo passes, and eventually there's the Gadsden Purchase along with that, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo adds California. California is going to be a big deal because that same year, gold is discovered in California. People move to California, and the United States, meanwhile, thinks it has many, many years to deal with the California problem. They say, oh, don't worry, they're not going to be a state for a long time. They're not a state until they have at least 50,000 eligible voters. That's going to take a long time. And then gold's discovered. Everyone moves there in 1849, thus the San Francisco 49ers football team, if you're familiar with that. And suddenly California wants to be admitted as a state, and we have to decide what to do. And the Missouri Compromise doesn't work anymore. It worked for partitioning the Louisiana Purchase, but the Missouri Compromise doesn't work. California is too large. It also goes way further. We need to have a new compromise, and we end up coming with the Compromise of 1850. That also is explicitly listed in the concept outline in the College Board's questions about this era. So know the Compromise of 1850. There are some minor parts of it with popular sovereignty and end of slave trade and things like that. But basically, your two biggest parts are California is a free state in exchange for a beefed up Fugitive Slave Act. There was a Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, but it was not very well enforced, whereas the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850 is way more beefed up. It requires people up north to act as sheriffs to arrest any slaves. This means that escaped slaves or escaped enslaved persons, must run away to Canada and not just to northern states. It essentially means that there are no free states anymore, and this is going to be, of course, a larger issue as we get further and further on this timeline. By the way, this timeline is very clearly not to scale, right? Is it 2 years or is it 11 years? But either way, there's a lot of events that go on here, and you should be aware of these. 1852 is the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Again, just exacerbates tension, makes tensions worse. People up north go, wow, I didn't know slavery was so bad. People down south go, that's not how bad slavery was. And then they start to argue even more. 1854 is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and thus the formation of the Republican Party. Remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act gets passed, but at the cost of destroying the second party system. Almost all opposition comes from the north, Whigs and Democrats alike. Almost all support comes from the South, Whigs and Democrats alike. So those parties start to split a little bit. We get the so-called conscience Whigs. Slavery bothers their conscience, Northerners largely, and the so-called cotton Whigs, Whigs for whom slavery and thus cotton, nice alliteration there, doesn't really bother them. And a lot of those conscience Whigs are going to join the Republican Party, which is formed by former know-nothings, some Liberty Party people, some Free Soilers, and from some Northern Democrats that don't like slavery, but especially the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the Republican Party is a sectional party. It is only in the North for the most part. I don't want to say exclusively, but basically you can think of it as just a Northern party at this point. And it only cares about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, at least at first. And that's its whole reason for existing. There's plenty of other parts of their platform that we could talk about later, Transcontinental Railroad and Homestead Act and things like that. But they're basically formed as an anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act party. Remember, this destroys the Missouri Compromise. It allows for popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, as engineered by Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's eventual opponent in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And this tears the country apart. It starts bleeding Kansas when people start to move into Kansas because you can't vote against me, popular sovereignty style, if you're dead. So there's a lot of acrimony, a lot of violence in bleeding Kansas, and that's essentially the first shooting of the Civil War, if you want to get kind of technical there. In 1857, we have Dred Scott v. Sanford, and remember, this is the famous case where Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, instead of just saying, oh, you don't have any standing, go away, Mr. Dred Scott, he instead says that black people have no rights, that the white people need to respect. He also says that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. He basically throws out any concept of free and slave states, which means that slavery can exist wherever, because he says that slaves are property and you can't deprive people of property. So a fairly common interpretation of slaves as property back then, but the thing that makes people really, really mad is the fact that there are no longer any free states. Fugitive slaves don't really exist in the North. They're still slaves and you need to arrest them. So in response to the Fugitive Slave Act and in response to these things, Northern states start to pass what are called personal liberty laws that are supposed to subvert the Fugitive Slave Acts little bit of interesting states' rights there from the North, and a little bit of nullification almost, again, from the North. So we're in this long and proud tradition of states' rights, nullification stuff, like proud tradition of South Carolina and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions going all the way back to the 1790s. So there's definitely some contention and some conflict there between the states and the federal government. In 1858, we have the Lincoln-Douglas debates, very famous just because Lincoln gets kind of onto the national stage. This is one of the first events that gets reported verbatim, word for word in the newspapers, so people can follow the debates wherever they occur. And we're talking hour-long debates where they talk about slavery. It really brings it into the national consciousness. They'd been thinking about slavery for a while, but Lincoln-Douglas sort of helped to popularize the various positions on that. And then in 1860, Lincoln gets elected president. Remember, he does not win his Senate seat against Douglas, but then eventually he becomes president in 1860. Without receiving a single vote from the South. So they get really angry about that. They're worried that he's going to take their slaves, and they're really mad about the northern states not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. So then we start to get secession starting in 1860 with South Carolina, and then 1861 is the rest of the Deep South. So that's the road to the Civil War. That's a lot of events. There's a lot of dates there too. I actually just gave my APUSH students their first date quiz today. It was over periods 1 through 3, but pretty soon they're going to take one over periods 1 through 5. I don't want to be one of those teachers, either on this stream or in my class, who advocate for memorizing tons of dates for absolutely no reason. However, I will tell you that when it comes to the APUSH reading and when we grade your essays, the number one problem that comes up year after year after year, according to the Chief Reader Report, is that students don't know their dates. They don't know chronology. They mention things that are outside of the time period. They mention things causing things when they're actually in effect of them. Students need to know dates. So if you want to do well and you want to have a leg up on the exam or even on your class exam, knowing some dates is really, really helpful. This is just a sampling here on this slide, but knowing some of these dates would be very, very helpful. Not necessarily because they all cause each other, but for instance, you should know that the Mexican-American War comes before the Compromise of 1850, because the Mexican-American War is why we take over the territory that is involved in the Compromise of 1850, namely California. So knowing those dates would be helpful, especially because the College Board loves to use big dates to be able to frame their essay questions or their short answer questions. They might say, talk about one way in which slavery evolved between 1800 and 1850. And thus you need to know, 1800, election of Thomas Jefferson. Okay, talk about some Jefferson stuff. 1850, Compromise of 1850. Hey, there you go. You got some changes going on. So options there. And again, just my recommendation, you should know some dates, mostly because of chronology, but there's also some good dates to know along the way. So here's a possible LEQ for you. Evaluate the extent to which controversies over expansion of slavery led to the Civil War. You have a mountain of evidence that you could talk about when you talk about the expansion of slavery out west. You can start with the Louisiana Purchase and the Missouri Compromise. Heck, you could even start with the Northwest Ordinance. This doesn't give you any dates, but if they don't give you any dates, you can use whatever to talk about the Northwest Ordinance and about how the Northwest Territory is free of slavery, but then the Missouri Compromise is not. You can talk about Kansas, Nebraska, about the Compromise of 1850, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Wilmot Proviso. All of those items might be a good way to talk about controversies over the expansion of slavery leading to the Civil War. You could also add some complexity by talking about other reasons why they were arguing over slavery and not necessarily its expansion. So you could mention William Lloyd Garrison along the way. You could mention Nat Turner's Rebellion. You could mention the fact that there are abolitionists like John Brown going all over the place, Bleeding Kansas, etc. A lot of options there, but just a possible LEQ for you to think about. And again, I can't predict what's going to be on your exam or on the May exam either, but being able to guess at least somewhat logically and being able to think through some of these LEQs, this is a nice way of summarizing kind of what we were just doing. So if you could answer this sort of question, then I think you're well on your way toward doing well on any question that would be around this topic. Any questions so far? Just want to make sure I'm not losing anybody here. We're talking about the controversies that lead to the Civil War. Want to make sure we're doing okay. Again, if you have questions, you can ask questions down below. You can put them in the chat. Whatever is fine with me. Looks like we're doing okay. All right, let's keep going. So a little bit of geography might be helpful. Right here we have a picture of the Missouri Compromise that we were talking about. And let me get my pointer working here. So we got ourselves Missouri right here. Missouri becomes a slave state thanks to the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise line is the southern border of Missouri. Looks a little bit like this. And remember, it only goes up to this line right here because we're only talking about the Louisiana Purchase and not the rest of this. This is all Spanish territory at this point. If you're saying, does the manifest destiny of Cuba and other countries that the U.S. tries to take lead to the Civil War? The United States has some kind of, great question, by the way. The United States has some kind of crazy schemes for taking over Cuba, but most of those happen after the Civil War. And so some of that happens during Ulysses S. Grant's administration in the 1860s and 1870s. And then there's the whole Spanish-American War kind of stuff where the United States fights Spain in Cuba and then kind of takes it over in a sense, not directly. But that happens in the 1890s. So manifest destiny of Cuba or any other sort of invasion of Latin American countries or the Caribbean, which the United States does way too much of later, that's all going to be after the Civil War. So manifest destiny before the Civil War, I would say confine yourself mostly to this area where we're talking from sea to shining sea, mostly across the continent of North America. Yeah, great question. So the Arkansas Territory right here, which is hilariously spelled this way on this map anyway, this part's the part that's open to slavery, and then everywhere above this line is close to slavery, and then Missouri itself becomes a slave state. That's somewhat useful to know, especially just to know your geography a little bit. Here's some more here. If we look at what happens after 1850, notice Missouri's right here, and then we have this problem with California once it becomes a state. And California, it becomes a free state. There's nothing to balance it out with Missouri, the way that Missouri and Maine were. So California becomes a free state in the Compromise of 1850 in exchange for a beefed-up Fugitive Slave Act. Then a little bit later, 1854, we have the Kansas and Nebraska territories, which are both open to slavery under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that idea of popular sovereignty, let the people decide, let them vote. Well, of course, this violates the Missouri Compromise line because they are both north of the Missouri Compromise line that we had already talked about, and they were part of the Louisiana Territory. And so that's one of the reasons why people get so mad about this Kansas-Nebraska Act and why people get so mad at Stephen Douglas particularly. Then we have Civil War geography. So let's start talking about the Civil War, but before we get into all the details there, let me just talk about this geography and what this map represents. So the dark red, I don't know if you can see it on your slide and your screen as well as mine, but Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida are the 7 original states to secede and form the Confederacy before Fort Sumter. So South Carolina is the first one to secede. They do so in December of 1860 after Lincoln is elected, but before he's inaugurated. And the rest of the Deep South, the ones that own the most slaves, have the highest percentage of slave owning. They're the ones that secede before Lincoln is even inaugurated. The rest of the Upper South waits. So Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. They wait. And once Lincoln decides to use force to bring the South back into the Union after they attack U.S. troops at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, Charleston Harbor, then the rest of those red states, the lighter red, the Upper South, they secede because they're not willing to use force against fellow Southerners. The blue states are free states that are part of the Union, part of the United States. Oh, everywhere is part of the United States, but you get what I'm saying. Part of the Union, those are free states. And then the yellow states are what's called the border states, with one possible exception. That is, West Virginia is not on this map. West Virginia actually doesn't like slavery and actually secedes from Virginia during the middle of the Civil War. Kind of a fun fact there. But Missouri, right there, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, those are slave states that stay in the Union. They are thus known as the border states. They're kept in the Union through a variety of means, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So that's your basic Civil War geography there, just so you're wondering, and in case you wanted to know. So, brief overview of the Civil War. These are topics 5.8, 5.9, if you're looking in the APUSH outline from the College Board. Remember that slavery is the context for the Civil War. It's not necessarily why everyone's fighting in it, but it certainly is what causes it all together, right? You read all these secession documents from South Carolina, and they don't say, oh, we'd like to leave because we have this theory on government that's a little bit different than yours. They say, no. our government is going to be founded on the basis that the white man is not equal to the black man, and that subordination, that is servanthood, is the ideal place for the black man. We're also really mad that the North will not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, and those are the reasons why they secede. So keep that in mind, and also African Americans in general are going to play a huge role in the Civil War and in what the College Board cares about that you know about the Civil War. There are some key victories that we should talk about, not because, again, we're going to turn this into a military history session, but because we should know some of the context and larger meanings behind some of these. So first one is Antietam. This one happens about a year and some change into the war. Antietam is hugely important because it's the first time that the North doesn't lose. It's the first time Lee doesn't really win. General Robert E. Lee is the main general for the South that we're concerned with here, and he invades Maryland, and he gets turned back at the Battle of Antietam. It's technically a draw, but Lincoln turns it into a victory by just claiming that, hey, at least the South didn't win, I guess, this time. And then he's able to issue the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which then goes into effect January 1, 1863. Officially, this also is one of the reasons why the European powers, England and France, will not join on the side of the Confederacy. Partly because of slavery, partly because of the Emancipation Proclamation making it very clear that it's about slavery, and partly because they don't see the South as being a super easy win. Excuse me. Whew. Also, Vicksburg. Vicksburg in 1863. Wow. This is going to happen a year later. We still are fighting the war, and Vicksburg is when Ulysses S. Grant manages to capture Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi. It cuts the Confederacy in two. It gives the Union control of the Mississippi, and it leads Lincoln to promote Ulysses S. Grant, who's probably the best general in the war, and that's kind of a big deal. Happening about the same time, Vicksburg surrenders on July 4, hoping to get better conditions on an American holiday. The same day that Lee retreats from Gettysburg. Gettysburg is fought July 1, 2, and 3. Whereas Antietam is the bloodiest day in American history, Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War because it happens over 3 days. It's the Confederate high water mark, so to speak. It's the farthest north into Pennsylvania that Lee ever gets. And it's also going to result in huge casualties. We're talking about 50,000 casualties. So Gettysburg is another turning point. And then Mobile Bay and Atlanta that happened in 1864. This is still a year later, and people are getting really, really sick of this. In fact, there are some draft riots in New York City that you should be familiar with. There's some opposition to Lincoln back home. People known as Copperheads or Peace Democrats. People are against the war. There's some opposition to the draft. There's opposition to rationing. And we even need to use some troops from Gettysburg to suppress some of the New York draft riots that happened in 1863. So the United States wins the battles of Mobile Bay and Atlanta. Atlanta is famous because of the whole Sherman's March to the Sea. Mobile Bay is the last major Confederate port city that the United States needed to capture. But either way, these are both coming at a crucial time because they give Lincoln a bit of morale boost right before the election. Again, kind of crazy to think about, but Lincoln has to run for re-election in the middle of an insurgency, in the middle of a rebellion. That's crazy. And so Lincoln is running against McClellan, a general that he fired. He's a peace Democrat, though. And Lincoln wants to be able to finish the war and finish it by ending slavery. And McClellan wouldn't really care how to finish it. He just wants the war done. So because Mobile Bay and Atlanta happen, Lincoln gets reelected. Therefore, the war is going to be finished all the way to the end, which is just going to include getting rid of slavery. That's a big deal. So again, why does the North win? Resources and infrastructure. I think we've covered this a little bit before with the market revolution, but the North has more trains, has more factories, has more production capability, and also just more people. And so they are able to overwhelm the South with their resources, with their men. Eventually, Ulysses S. Grant is able to outmaneuver and outfight Robert E. Lee, and the infrastructure helps to move troops around, and the Southern infrastructure is devastated after the war. One more topic that you need to know from the College Board is Lincoln's leadership and rhetoric. Lincoln tries to unite the country together, things like the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, and then the fact that Lincoln is trying to bring the nation back together. That would be a big deal as well. And his rhetoric would be exemplified in things like his first inaugural address, where he talks about the Union bringing the country together so much. The Gettysburg Address, where he starts to talk about a new birth of freedom. So again, kind of shifting. The war has always been about slavery, but now he's making it an explicit goal to get rid of slavery rather than just restoring the Union. And then his second inaugural address, I would be at least a little bit familiar with that, where he talks about binding up the nation's wounds and how if we need to get rid of all slavery in order to make up for the fact that, or if we need to all bleed to make up for the fact that we had slavery in order to get rid of it, that's fine. And so Lincoln's leadership and rhetoric helped the United States get through this as well. So let's talk about this a little bit more. African Americans in the Civil War and Lincoln. There are some really important events that I'd be familiar with. Lower right-hand corner, we have Lincoln, obviously. Lower left-hand corner, we got Fort Wagner and the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment. So talking about that, there are some American ideals such as equality and freedom that are really on the line with the Civil War. And we start to see some progress. We start to see things like the Emancipation Proclamation, which doesn't actually free any slaves because it only applies in areas that are in open rebellion, aka not listening to Lincoln. But the Emancipation Proclamation does lead, of course, to slaves being able to run away to Union lines and free themselves by joining the Union. Remember, this is the idea of contraband, and contraband would be anything that is being used in an illegal way, and secession and rebellion and treason are illegal. And if the South is using slaves to do that, then the slaves can be confiscated. So that's how Lincoln justifies the Emancipation Proclamation. There's also the Gettysburg Address, where he talks about the new birth of freedom. We already talked about that, and contraband as well. And then the 54th Massachusetts. This is a famous segregated black unit led by Robert Gould Shaw, the white gentleman you can see right there. This is an all-black unit, but it's led by a white officer because, again, the North is still a little bit racist and insists upon white people leading black people. But there are lots of examples of African Americans serving during the Civil War. They volunteer in huge numbers. We're talking over 110,000. And there's not a single black person drafted, which is amazing. And so everybody who serves the United States willingly and voluntarily. There aren't any blacks that fight for the Confederacy, but there are lots of blacks who fight for the Union, which makes a lot of sense, to free themselves, to free their families, to be able to end slavery, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation allows black people to join the United States Armed Forces. Still in segregated units, still a ways to go. That'll last for another 100 years or so. But the 54th Massachusetts is one of the most famous examples of African Americans fighting for the rights during this time. I'd be familiar with that a little bit. All right, so we've just finished the Civil War. I want to make sure that we don't have any questions about that. Do you have any questions about the Civil War, about Lincoln, about African Americans, about some of those battles, why the North wins? The South eventually has problems with bread riots, with inflation. They can't sell their cotton. They can't get past the blockade, the Anaconda Plan, and can't get enough money, enough weapons. Yeah, I feel like that's most of what we needed to cover for the Civil War itself. I want to make sure we don't have any other questions as we go. Otherwise, again, feel free to put those questions in whenever you need to. All right, let's talk about Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is one of my favorite time periods. I don't know, when I was in high school, I was always, or even younger, when we got to Reconstruction, I went, man, no more cool battles like during the Civil War. I guess we're just going to have to talk about building the country back again. This is not a big deal. I don't really like this too much. But Reconstruction, when it's properly understood, I think is one of the most pivotal time periods in American history, and it's crucial to understanding modern-day race relations. Plus, it's important for the College Board on the APUSH exam too, right? So let's talk about Reconstruction questions. Two big Reconstruction questions that we can list right off the bat. What should the U.S. do with the rebels, and what should the U.S. do with the freedmen? What do you do with the former Confederates? Do you punish them? Do you hang them? Do you exclude them from public office? Do you throw them all in jail? How do you determine who fought willingly and who was drafted? How do you know? What are all the motivations? Do you just imprison the leaders? It gets complicated. And then what should the U.S. do with the freedmen? They're these formerly enslaved people. Do you give them land? We end up not, big mistake. They're not very self-sufficient that way, and they end up kind of sliding back towards slavery. In the famous words of W.E.B. Du Bois, during Reconstruction, the slave stood a moment in the sun and became not a slave, and then slowly retreated back towards slavery, sort of in the shadows. And so that's going to be an unfortunate part of Reconstruction. A lot of promises and a lot of promise, but then it doesn't fulfill all that promise and doesn't end up going so well. And then the third question is going to be, who gets to decide those two questions, the president or Congress? Reconstruction is going to be a time where we start to talk about politics. We start to talk about the three branches interacting with each other a whole lot. The Supreme Court steps in a couple of times. Congress gets really powerful during this time period, and we have our first presidential impeachment ever. So that's rather important. Some major players for you. We got this guy. Hopefully you recognize him as Lincoln. This guy right here, Lincoln's vice president, that's going to be Andrew Johnson. Then we have these two gentlemen, a little bit more obscure, but you'll probably recognize their names. They're the congressional radical Republicans that we should be familiar with, who are interested in punishing the rebels and protecting the freedmen, and that's going to be Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. So be aware of some of these gentlemen. Might not be a bad idea to know some of them and their names and what they want. Johnson is a Southern Democrat who was loyal to the Union. That's why he's taken by Lincoln to be part of his Union Party ticket that brings the country together in 1864. But when Lincoln gets shot, Johnson takes over Reconstruction, and that's not good. Lincoln had established things like the Freedmen's Bureau. He had the 10% plan. He wanted to bring the nation back together. Johnson was more interested in punishing the Southern elites. He grew up very poor. He blamed the entire Civil War on the plantation owners, the elites who owned all the slaves, and he wanted to punish them, but he didn't give two hoots about protecting African-American rights, and that was a bit of a problem. So Sumner and Stevens are going to be facing off with Johnson, and we're going to see this in a couple of different times. The reason I also like Reconstruction is because there are so many cartoons that you can see. Now, I can't guarantee that you're going to see a Reconstruction cartoon on an exam in your class or in May, but chances are pretty good that you probably will see one at some point. And so there's a lot of Reconstruction cartoons, a lot of them written by one of my favorite historical cartoonists of all time, Thomas Nast, and you're going to be able to interpret some of these things by the time you're done, hopefully pretty soon. And I want to walk through some of these and talk about some big issues during Reconstruction. We'll get to the cartoons in just a little bit, but again, talk about some overview first. How does Reconstruction change the United States? It's going to change how federalism works. The Civil War made the United States federal, that is national government, way more powerful, not only because it was ordering lots of stuff and it was imprisoning people through Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, and because people were getting drafted, and also they were deciding that the federal government was able to confiscate people's property thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, all of those things. Speaking of constitutional changes, we have three big constitutional amendments that you absolutely must know from this time period. The 13th Amendment that says no slavery, passed in 1865. The 14th Amendment in 1867, equal citizenship, 1868. Equal citizenship under the law. Everyone born in the United States is a citizen, birthright citizenship, except for Native Americans, and they're supposed to be treated equally under the law. Then the 15th Amendment says you can have voting rights for black males, sort of. The problem is that each of these are going to have loopholes. Now, not to downplay this, if you're talking about changes, if you get a change in continuity over time question, and you want to talk about changes during Reconstruction, the constitutional amendments are huge changes that you absolutely must know. They are promises that are put down into the Constitution. They cannot be taken away. And eventually MLK will eventually say something like, hey, I'm here to cash the check. We were promised equality. We were promised voting rights. Let's have it now. Unfortunately, during this time, we're going to see a lot of these undermined through loopholes or just plain undermining through the Supreme Court. So black codes, laws that only apply to African Americans, are going to lead to what's on the right-hand side there, that picture. That's convict leasing. The 13th Amendment has a loophole where slavery is abolished except as punishment of a crime, which means that if you convict someone of being a criminal, you can arrest them and make them work on a chain gang or rent out the prisoners, so-called, to various companies like the coal mining companies down south around Atlanta and places like that. So black codes, which took away Second Amendment rights from African Americans, which meant they couldn't start their own businesses. They had to work for a white person. Vagrancy laws were a part of that. You couldn't be unemployed. You couldn't be self-employed. You couldn't work for another black person. You had to work for a white person and have that in writing at all times. Otherwise, you could be arrested, which is just crazy. The KKK is a bit of a loophole because you can't have equal citizenship if you're in constant fear for your life. We're eventually going to be talking about Jim Crow laws and things like that. That happens after 1877, poll taxes and literacy tests. But those will be things that take away voting rights and equal citizenship. And sharecropping is not necessarily equal either. You're not technically a slave because you're not owned. But again, you're stuck in a cycle of debt and you can't actually leave. So be aware of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Be aware of what they mean and then also what their loopholes are, because that will be really important for adding some nuance to an essay, let's say. There's also some Supreme Court cases like United States v. Cruikshank and the Slaughterhouse cases that undermine the 14th Amendment by saying things like, oh, the 14th Amendment only applies to states, not to individuals, thus you can't crack down on the KKK, or that the rights guaranteed in the Constitution only apply to the federal government, not to states, and therefore they can't really intervene. And it just gets really, really, really complicated. And the Supreme Court basically steps back from the 14th Amendment and says, oh, we didn't actually mean that. And so we don't give equality to African Americans. It's really sad. A lot of promise there. So before we step into Reconstruction cartoons and we talk about these and how to interpret some of them and some big events here, any questions thus far? Any questions about Reconstruction that I can help to answer? We're going to go over some things like Johnson's impeachment in just a little bit. Want to make sure we're doing okay. All right, sweet. Let's go on to some cartoons. By the way, just as a brief warning, a brief caveat, some of these cartoons are going to be from that, well, they're all from that time period, but some of them are going to be really racist because they're from that time period. And so that's actually an important thing to know because it'll help you interpret the point of view of the cartoons. So this one's not super racist, but we'll see one in just a little bit. So this is Lincoln over here and Johnson over here, and they are repairing the Union. Notice the title of it is called, I'm sorry, I keep messing it up with my mouse. It's called The Rail Splitter at Work, Repairing the Union. Lincoln used to split rails, a.k.a. cut pieces of wood for use in fences. And Johnson used to be a tailor. Andrew Johnson was a tailor way before he was president. So they're both bringing the Union back together. But notice they're doing it in different ways. They have different plans. And by the way, in case you're wondering how you could tell that, notice he calls him Uncle Abe, and then he calls him Andy. So you know that this is Andy, this is Uncle Abe, Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, both trying to repair the Union, but in different ways. Andrew Johnson is going to get really, really into Congress's face. He's going to be impeached. He keeps vetoing a whole bunch of things. He tries to get rid of the Freedmen's Bureau. He thinks it's a bunch of handouts for black people, even though they've been working for 250 years with no pay. He still doesn't think they deserve anything, so he thinks they're going to be lazy. And thus he gets impeached. Now, he gets impeached partly because he goes against Congress and they find him annoying. He gets impeached because he gives drunken speeches all over the place. But the main reason is he violates the Tenure of Office Act. He tries to fire some radical Republicans in his cabinet, including Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Kind of a funny story there. I read about Johnson barricading himself in his Stanton barricading himself in his office and refusing to be taken out. But Johnson gets impeached. Now, in impeachment, which you might know if you're following the news, it starts in the House and then it moves to the Senate, and the Senate has to vote to convict with a 2/3 vote. Well, Johnson escapes impeachment by one vote. More than half of the senators vote to impeach him and to convict him, to remove him from office, but they're missing the 2/3 majority. So technically, he is impeached. He's charged with a crime. He is not convicted and therefore not removed from office. A subtle distinction, one you should be familiar with. The radical Republicans, then, your Thaddeus Stevens, your Charles Sumner, they have a supermajority in Congress, and they are then going to take over. Andrew Johnson knows that he was just one false step away from getting that additional vote, so he simmers down after his impeachment, and Congress takes over in what's called Congressional Reconstruction in 1867, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So Johnson did not like the Freedmen's Bureau. You can see it in this cartoon right here. The Freedmen's Bureau is an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. This cartoonist thinks that the Freedmen's Bureau is going to make black people lazy, even though they've been working for us white people for free for 250 years. And notice it says twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. If you support Congress, you support the black person. If you sustain the president, you protect the white man. So it's obviously telling people to vote for Johnson, to support him, and to not support radical Republicans because it'll support the black man. You can tell, you can tell that the cartoonist does not like black people and doesn't like the Freedmen's Bureau because of the way he's drawing the African-American, right? Drawing him kind of lazy here, ape-like features, just a super racist depiction, which is really not cool. So Johnson eventually cedes control to Congress. Congress, in this Thomas Nast cartoon, Columbia, who represents the United States, is kind of taking on the view of Congress, saying this is called pardon. This two-parter right here. The first part's called pardon. Shall I trust these men? And then over here it says franchise, which means voting, and not this man. So Columbia says, shall I trust these guys, these former Confederates, and yet not this guy? who is a former Union soldier who gave his leg for his country? Should I give him the right to vote? Oh my goodness. So the radical Republicans think that we should keep these people down, not necessarily punish them in terms of locking them up, but don't let them back in the government, and certainly give this guy rights, because if anyone deserves the right to vote, it's black veterans who literally put their lives on the line for our country. So then eventually they will clash, and this is another famous cartoon about Andrew Johnson and Thaddeus Stevens. You notice there's the president railroad car and the Congress railroad car, and they're both going to collide with each other, and they're just having a fight, and this is what leads to impeachment. Once Congress takes over, they're going to put troops down south via what are called the Reconstruction Acts. And as you can see in this cartoon, it's incredibly important that there are troops down south, what is sometimes called the bayonet rule. They are ruling over the South by the bayonet, the pointy thing at the end of the rifle, because these soldiers down south are the only thing standing between all of these white mobs and this freedman. Notice in the background you see things like KKK, call home your troops. We intend to beat the Negro in the battle of life, and defeat means one thing: extermination. Alabama, my goodness. So these troops down south, although not super effective because they were only in urban areas, are really the only thing standing between African Americans and getting completely disenfranchised, no rights, and being put back to slavery. So this lasts for a while, although not as long as it should have. Right here, you got an example of a loophole in the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says you can't stop people from voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Well, an effective way around that is just plain old violence. This is called, of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket. Again, not modern day Democrats, we're talking back then. And the Democratic reformer, some of these guys right here say, you're as free as air, ain't you? Say you are, or I'll blow your black head off. That's the text at the bottom there. So are black people actually free to vote however they want? No. This cartoon definitely shows that. And then we have this famous cartoon, the strong government and the weak government. This cartoon actually is rather sympathetic to the South in a way that's kind of racist. It's talking about how the solid South, that's right over here, the solid South is depicted as this sympathetic, wanting woman who's walking a hard road. She's getting burdened by the bayonet rule and the carpetbag rule with Ulysses S. Grant, troops down south. Notice the South is still pretty devastated from the war. Ships are sunk. Homes are burned. The Hall of Justice is occupied by the military. And she's in change. And this is called the Strong Government, 1869 to 1877, a.k.a. when Grant's in charge and he cracks down on the KKK. Well, then we have the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, sometimes called, borrowing from John Green here, Rutherfraud B. Hayes. There's the crazy election of 1876. We don't know who wins. And there's this electoral commission that eventually comes up with the compromise of 1877. Hayes gets to become president, which is what the Northern Republicans wanted. And in exchange, they're going to remove the troops from the South, which is what the Southern Democrats wanted. Now, this cartoonist likes this compromise because he thinks Hayes is turning the weapons into plows, a little biblical allusion there, turning swords into plowshares. And then notice in the background, we maybe have sharecropping, but either way, the farms are back at it again. Cotton's being sold. Factories are occurring. There's trading going on. And this is occurring in the same area, just from a slightly different angle. Hayes is literally plowing up the carpetbag, the bayonet rule, and all those things that used to be a part of the South's burden to bear. So this cartoonist thinks that it was okay that we removed troops from the South, even though that leads to unimaginable violence down South, lynching and stuff like that. So Reconstruction ends in 1877 with the Compromise of 1877. You should know that. You should know about Rutherford B. Hayes and why his election matters. A couple more cartoons. One of the reasons why they think, and this is a Thomas Nast cartoon, why he thinks that this is worse than slavery is, notice the White League and the KKK are shaking hands, talking about they want the Union as it was. It's a white man's government, the lost cause, which refers to the fact that people would claim the Civil War was not about slavery and that the KKK were really just heroic people standing up for white women especially. But notice in the middle, it's worse than slavery because we have a black guy getting hung in the background. There's no longer an incentive to keep black people alive because they are investments the way they were under slavery. Now, granted, we're glad that slavery's done. There's no longer that dehumanization, which is just awful. But in this case, black people can be almost more vulnerable sometimes. There's a burned down schoolhouse. There's a child in the arms of some parents that are either cowering in fear or crying because he's dead. It's rather unclear, but either way, that family is in trouble. And so Reconstruction represents great promise for African Americans, and then it really, really goes south, pun intended there, when a lot of these KKK people are able to take over, and eventually the governments go back into the hands of white people who are not interested in African American rights, the so-called redeemers. So 1876, just to go over this one more time, it's Hayes versus Tilden in the election of 1876. The South is threatening secession here. Notice they're holding a bullwhip representing slavery. They're holding a gun and saying, elect our guy, Hayes, elect our guy, Tilden, not Hayes. But eventually the North is able to disarm them like this, and they're able to have this compromise. And the compromise is that, again, Hayes becomes president, which is what the Northern Republicans wanted. In exchange, the Southern Democrats get the troops removed from the South, and that's the grand compromise. They're supposed to respect the rights of freedmen. Look at this cartoon right here. The Southern gentleman there who's wearing a mustache that looks like he's a Disney villain who's about to tie a damsel to a railroad track. He says, why, Mr. Exode Caesar, you're a man and a brother after all. Step into my parlor. The problem is his nickname is Solid Brutus, and his nickname is Exode, like Exodus Caesar. And if you know anything about Roman history, a guy named Caesar should not trust a guy named Brutus, because what does Brutus do to Caesar, Julius Caesar? He stabs him in the back. So when there's all these promises, the colored race have rights that even the white race are bound to respect. No more shotgun policies, no more KKK, no more Southern bayonets at the polls. Well, not quite sure we should trust this guy with all of his promises. And so that's kind of the end of Reconstruction. So let me pause right there. Any questions that you have right now about Reconstruction? Again, lots of cartoons, lots of topics you could talk about, but what to do with former freedmen, what to do with former slaves, freedmen, and then what to do with the Confederates is a big question. Alyssa asks, can you explain Rutherford B. Hayes again? Yeah, so let me just paint a picture for you. So you got Lincoln, who's assassinated, and then Johnson takes over from him for 4 years. He's never actually elected himself. Then Grant becomes president from 1868 until 1876. He runs for 2 terms. There's a lot of corruption that goes on there, but he's able to crack down on the KKK a little bit. This is during Reconstruction. Then in 1876, we have this very, very close election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. And there's a lot of corruption that goes on down south, a lot of shenanigans, a lot of violence at the polls. And at the end of the day, we don't know who wins the election. And it goes on for weeks and months, and we still don't know who won the election. Now, the election happened in November, and the inauguration is supposed to happen in March. But by January, we're still trying to figure out who won the presidency because of some voting irregularities in, of course, Florida and Louisiana and South Carolina. Well, eventually they come up with this electoral commission made up of Republicans and Democrats, and they meet together and they hash out this big compromise of 1877. And this compromise of 1877 says Rutherford B. Hayes, a Northern Republican, gets to be president, and in exchange, the Southern Democrats get a promise that Hayes is going to remove the troops from the South, remove United States troops from the South, no longer federally occupy those areas. The South is supposed to promise to respect black rights, but we all know that's not really going to happen once the troops are removed. So Rutherford B. Hayes, we don't really talk about his presidency a whole lot in APUSH, but his election is incredibly important because it's part of the trade that gets the troops removed from the South and essentially ends Reconstruction for 2 reasons. One, the South was consistently opposing it, and they just they refused to change. And 2, the North got really sick of this. They said, we've been reconstructing for we've been reconstructing for a decade. Can't we be done now? So Southern intransigence, Southern stubbornness, combined with Northern weariness, they were just sick of Reconstruction. That's one of the reasons why Reconstruction ends with the Compromise of 1877. Great question, Alyssa. Thank you for that. Any other questions that we should be aware of? Otherwise, let's head into some practice short answer questions. We're almost out of time for this evening, so I'll just give you a couple of these. These should be helpful for you as you study to make sure you have some of the big overarching themes. First one, briefly describe how one specific event led to increased sectional tensions between 1793 and 1860. 1793 being, of course, the Cotton Gin, and 1816 being the election of Abraham Lincoln. Could you talk about an event that increases sectional tensions between this time? Absolutely. Anything from that timeline that we talked about earlier would work. Anything about slavery would work. Describe one specific way in which immigration changed the U.S. You could talk about how they moved to the Northeast, how they got factory jobs, how they were bringing in new ideas, how it led to a backlash, the so-called nativism with the so-called know-nothing party. People were opposed to these Catholics coming in, especially, or people that would drink a whole lot. Irish and Germans being largely Catholic and stereotypically drinking a whole lot. People that were in favor of temperance or Protestantism didn't like them. Those are some changes there. Describe a specific way in which the lives of African Americans changed between 1865 and 1877. This is all about Reconstruction. Mention the amendments. Mention the loopholes. Something like that. Then a couple other ones. What was a challenge faced by the United States on the home front during the Civil War? You could talk about the Peace Democrats, the re-election of Lincoln in 1864. You could talk about the New York draft riots. You could talk about the draft in general. You could talk about Peace Democrats, Copperheads, a lot of options there. Briefly describe one specific way in which Reconstruction changed the structure of U.S. government. It's going to lead to increased power in Congress rather than in the presidency. It's going to lead to increased power of the federal government as they occupy the South. It's going to change the structure of U.S. government by adding amendments to the Constitution and the First Amendment and the first impeachment in U.S. history. And then briefly describe one specific way in which the gains of Reconstruction were undermined between 1865 and 1896. 1865 is the end of the Civil War and the start of Black Codes. 1896, which is going way beyond Reconstruction, but still talking about some of these problems. 1896 is going to be the famous case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which legalizes Jim Crow, legalizes racial segregation, and thus completely undermines the 14th Amendment because you can't be equal if you are separate. So those are some practice short answer questions. Remember, it's a good idea to follow that ACE formula as you go. So you want to drop your vocab word, you want to explain what the vocab is, and then tell us how it answers that question. So you want to talk about the New York draft riots, and the New York draft riots were in opposition largely from some immigrants, but also from Democrats who were against the war. And this was a challenge on the home front because Lincoln had to figure out how to get people to not be resisting the draft violently. Something like that. Not exactly the best example, but you get my idea. So those are some practice SAQs. Be able to answer those. And I think you're well on your way to making sure you know all of period 5. Any other questions or concerns that I can go about now before we end for tonight? Remember period 5, road to the Civil War itself, and then the aftermath of the Civil War, aka Reconstruction. That's basically what you're going to need to know. And all right, seems like we're okay. Thank you very much for your attention, for your help, for your questions. You folks are great. Remember, you've got this. Take care of what you need to get done. If it's a period 5 test coming up, I hope you nail it. If it's an exam coming up, I hope you do well there too. Check back with us at Fiveable. We will be with you till the end with a variety of resources. And good luck. APUSH is awesome. I hope you folks do a good job with whatever you have coming up. Have a great night, a great rest of your week, and a great